Thank you very much. I've caught out on my own message. Thank you very much. So the talk is primarily going to be by me, but Geoff is actually here, so I will make sure he's introduced. It's nice to have the subject of the talk as well as the talk itself. So I'm just going to activate my. So you can imagine, because I'm running things in the background, I have a lot of windows open. Here we go. Right. I think you can see me, and then hopefully you will see my screen. So I'm presenting through a web browser. So I have a few slides and they will have some of the user interface around them. So our talk today is revisiting and representing 1980s microcomputer art. It's by myself, Sean Clark, and Geoff Davis, who is the creator of the artworks. This is a continuing project in the Computer Arts Archive, which is a project we launched at last year's November EVA, the online EVA that took place 6 months after we would normally have EVA. And I'll just restate what the goals of this project are. So the Computer Arts Archive is a not-for-profit company that collects, exhibits and promotes computer arts for the benefit of artists, audiences, curators, educators and researchers. We collaborate with other collections, museums and galleries to explore the impact of digital culture and ensure that computer art is recognised as a significant contemporary art form with a rich and diverse history. In particular, we work closely with the Computer Arts Society, a member-based organisation founded in 1968. And as you can imagine, these sort of mission statements often take quite a long time to produce because you want to try and get everything in there. But the key things here are that we see the Computer Arts Archive's role as not just being an archive that's about putting stuff in drawers and maybe leaving it there, but it's a resource for artists. We want it to reach audiences, so we want our work to be seen. We want curators to be able to make use of the materials we collect. Educators, like the previous talk, being education relating to digital arts is very important. And also researchers in general, the conventional audience maybe for an archive. And collaboration is key as well. We want the work that we do to be part of a network of other potential users and exhibitors of this work. And of course, our relationship with the Computer Arts Society is vital and central to what we do. So in that context, I discovered microarts a number of years ago at a Computer Arts Society meeting. And I say I discovered it, it was really landed on my lap in that Geoff Davis, who ran the project, popped along to one of the meetings and said, I've got a collection of 1980s digital artwork that I made with colleagues on ZX Spectrums and BBC Micros. Now, those people sort of my age will instantly recognize those two computers because they were particularly important in establishing home computing in the 1980s. And personally, I used the BBC Micro when I was at school, and it was my first exposure to making images with computers. This project had been published as data cassettes, which were the typical format of the day. So the normal little audio cassettes that you might have had in a car were used to store computer data. When you played the cassette, you had sounds very similar to modem sounds, but the computer could read those, load the program up. There was a magazine, and also Geoff published the work on Prestel, a pre-web interactive information system that was delivered via the telephone, similar to maybe the teletext systems that you might have, some people might remember, that ran on television, that sort of layer of data that you could get in addition to the programs. These early artworks were a series of sequential, generative and interactive pieces, predominantly for the Spectrum, but one of the tapes was for the BBC Micro, like I say. Now, what instantly struck me about this was how rare it is to find work from this era so well preserved. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that the media that was used, the cassette tape, and often the printers, if the images were printed, were very ephemeral, really. Cassettes, as anyone knows who's ever had to stick a pencil in a cassette to try and get it all working, get it untangled, certainly don't last forever. Lucky sometimes they last half a dozen plays, but they're not the sorts of things that last for a long time. And the printouts at the time, often the papers were very poor. The inks, if it used ink rather than a thermal print, were not archival. So I was very aware that work from the 80s from microcomputers, home computers, was not very well preserved. There was also another issue, and something I had been thinking about prior to this, which was how the microcomputer, BBC Micro, ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and others, really was the first time that home users, maybe university or commercial people, had access to computer graphics. And I had been interested to know what creative people were doing at the time with those devices. Now, I was at school and I was making interesting enough little pictures, but I never really thought of them as art. Whereas what Geoff was doing and his colleagues, as they were exploring these devices and presenting the work as a artwork, sometimes with quotes around the titles, but they were certainly presenting this as art. So it was an opportunity really to collect some work produced in the 80s that was aware or self-aware. It was presented as art made on microcomputers. So the materials that we've managed to collect are the original ZX Spectrum software. Regretfully, we don't have access to the BBC software, but we're looking to collect videos of it and things like that. We then produced 24 19 by 13 inch archival prints from that software. Of those, 20 were of the ZX Spectrum artworks and 4 were of the BBC artworks. We had 4 cassettes. Originally, there were 3 cassettes produced, but a 4th one was in production. Now, the originals of those cassettes are extremely hard to get hold of. So Geoff has produced copies of the first 3, plus he produced a version of the 4th one as if it had been released. We also had the Micro Arts magazine that Geoff and colleagues produced in about 1985 or 6, and assorted items of ephemera. This includes an actual ZX Spectrum, related materials, magazines, things that can set the context to this collection of artwork. And what I'd like to do now, before I draw some conclusions, is take you through this collection. And I'm going to do this through the web browser. So I'm going to nip over to, one second. I'm going to nip over to another part of the browser, and hopefully I will have, I'm just having to check something. Yeah, I will have access to that. So the Computer Arts Archive, as I mentioned, this is our project produced in conjunction with the Computer Arts Society with its stated mission. We launched the project at EVA in November. It's a physical space. It's a very cramped physical space because we have a lot of artwork. We'd like to find a bigger space. That's the next job. And the Micro Arts collection is an online exhibition that we produced for last year. And obviously you can go through this in a bit more detail if you're interested, but it tells you about Micro Arts project, the data cassettes. There is a full copy of the magazine available as a downloadable or online browsable PDF. And we also have some information about the Prestel presentation. So Micro Arts on Prestel, 20th September 1985, which is a very long time ago, 36 years ago. It would be very interesting to try and represent the Prestel work, and that's something we have talked about. And there are now Prestel emulators, and you can create a Prestel-like experience, teletext-like experience, in fact, through the browser, that will render, if you like, Prestel pages. That's something that we might look at in the future. So we have information about the various outputs, and then we have a presentation of the artworks. Now, as I mentioned, we have 20 ZX Spectrum pieces now printed and 4 BBC Micro pieces printed. If I go into one of the typical works, this is from a series called Abstract Originals. And in a demo session on Thursday, we will be running the program live on an emulator so that you can see how these images are produced and how they grow and so on. For each video, for each image, we do typically have a video. So you can see various selections being made. Now, of course, this is running on an emulator. One of the things about these older devices is that a lot of enthusiasts love the ZX Spectrum, BBC Micro, and so on, and they've created emulators that will run original software. So despite this being 35 years old, we are able to run the original software on an emulator, and as you'll see a little bit later, on some hardware as well. And one of my first sort of observations here is that I sort of imagine if this was running on an academic computer or some sort of industrial machine, it would probably be very hard to present it 35 years later because that technology may not exist. In fact, there may not be an emulator for that technology. However, if you write art that runs on video game systems, you have a high degree of confidence that in the future, that video game system will be emulated. And I think very fortuitously, what Geoff has managed to do here is he sort of was able to preserve this work by virtue of using a popular device. And I think there's something to bear in mind for contemporary artists who would like to know that their work runs in 35 years' time or more, that obviously use devices that you think are likely to be of interest in 35 years. So use technologies, web browser, that sort of thing, that you think, well, there's a good chance that my artwork will run in 35 years. If you use custom technology or technology that requires slightly more obscure software, you probably won't be able to run the actual software in the future. People can look at your documentation, but you may find it very difficult to present your work. So I think it's very interesting that these devices are still, this software does still run at its normal speed in a very similar way to the original device. Now, if I go back, you can look for a whole series of works here. Again, videos with each of them. What I see here is a very strong imprint of the computer. In fact, I think if somebody showed me this image and said, what was it made on? I could probably say it was made on a ZX Spectrum. And that's because of the color palette, which was quite constrained, had certain colors in. The fact that most of the images were on black, that's a very ZX Spectrum thing. And even some of the characters here look very much reminiscent of the ZX Spectrum character set. Now, I don't know if at the time Geoff considered the ZX Spectrum to have an aesthetic of its own. Maybe he can tell us a bit later, but I certainly see what I might call a ZX Spectrum aesthetic. And images such as this one of my favorites, have that nice sort of almost constructivist feel. I think Geoff referred to them as abstract originals, but in quotes. It's up to you to decide if you felt these were artworks at the time. And they were designed to run in a sequential way, almost in the background. You could have them running as a sort of a picture on your television while you were having a dinner party. I think that's what Geoff mentioned once to me. And so we have a whole series of ZX Spectrum images. And then we have fewer, but equally important, some work created on the BBC Micro. And again, I think I can recognize the BBC Micro imprint on this. I used the BBC Micro for making my first images, and the colors, the number of pixels and so on, there's something about it which says BBC Micro to me. I wasn't aware of it at the time, obviously, but I think it's probably true almost of any technology that it has an imprint. If you're using it to present an artwork, it has a degree of recognizability. So a nice video from Martin Roots, one of the other contributors. So we have this online exhibition. This was launched, like I say, last November. Some of you may have seen it. If not, Computer Arts Archive is the web address, and you can have a look at this in a bit more detail. And there are lots of videos as well. Now, of course, what we really want to do are run on physical exhibitions. I typically would run 2 or 3 exhibitions a year. In COVID, last year, I didn't do any physical exhibitions. I did 2 online exhibitions. But this year, luckily, I've managed to do my first real physical exhibition. This was at the LCB depot in Leicester, my sort of home gallery, as it were. And the exhibition was entitled 8-Bit. This is the exhibition poster. As you can see, it's only just finished. And the exhibition poster, very much in the style of the ZX Spectrum at the Lightbox Gallery at the LCB depot. with support from Interact, my company, Computer Arts Archive, CAS, of course, MicroArts, and the LCB, our host venue. And here we go. Here is a nice picture of Geoff himself standing in front of some of the framed works. So what you can see here is the 24 images printed and framed. And this is the first time that they've been presented in this way. Geoff has exhibited some of the work elsewhere, not for quite a while. And what we were able to do here was to exhibit a big selection of the work, or images from the animated work, because of course it's computer-based work, at the exhibition. And I will take you through some of the documentation of this exhibition. So I printed the work archivally. So these are on Hahnemuhle paper with archival links. They should hopefully last a long time if I look after them. They are now in the storage cabinet at the archive. I also found various devices such as this, which is a lifelike ZX Spectrum, but is in fact a Bluetooth keyboard. And what I'm doing here is I've installed a Raspberry Pi inside the device that runs a Spectrum emulator. And this can run Geoff's software in a very realistic way. Now, I do also have a ZX Spectrum, but as you can imagine, older computers, I don't have the confidence that they will be working for a long time in the future. So I don't just want the work to be runnable on old computers, because the old computers may no longer work. So we produced a lovely set of prints and installed those in the gallery, together with a running version of the work. This is running Space Invaders, but it actually did run the work. And this was on a piece of hardware called a ZX Vega, which was a ZX Spectrum hardware emulator produced for games enthusiasts. But because it has a SD card slot on the front, we were able to run Geoff's original software in the gallery. So 35-year-old software running on a not too old piece of hardware in the gallery. Again, I sort of asked artists who are interested, contemporary artists who are interested in having their work preserved and shown in the future, how might that happen in 35 years' time? What would need to happen for your work to be shown in a way which is representative of it? It could be represented. It could be presented through documentation, but would you like the original artwork to be presented? It's more of a question than me having any answers. The supporting information included adverts of the original computers to give people a little bit of context for the devices that were being used. These were very much marketed as home computers. Sometimes they were promoted as a great solution for your home management of your home accounts, sometimes for gaming and so on. Very rarely were they presented as tools for art. Additional context, information panels, images of the cassette tapes and so on. And we'll see Geoff here again in front of the works. I was very happy with the presentation actually, because clearly these artworks were made on very low res devices. Now, we have cheated a little bit in that the emulator upscales, so we're able to print at a higher resolution. But because the images are really quite blocky, no anti-aliasing and so on, they do scale and print nicely. I personally felt they didn't need to be any bigger than this sort of A3 plus size, because the images would never have been shown on much bigger screens. So the prints I didn't feel needed to be on bigger pieces of paper. If you look at some of the ephemera, classic cabinet presentation of materials, additional things I have some great books on ZX Spectrum art and so on, which I've been collecting over the years. This is Geoff's original data cassette recorder. So this is the thing that played the tapes to get them into the computer. And again, for some context, ZX Spectrum magazines and Sinclair user magazines and so on. And here you see part of the exhibition, some of the prints, cabinets, screens, ephemera. A little bit more. And what it looked like running on the screen. And that's the actual, this is, I think this is MicroArts 1 running on the emulator, the hardware emulator in the gallery space. Now, the opening was, we thought the opening was going to be under some COVID restrictions. As it wasn't too bad. We were able to have up to 20 people in the space, as long as they wore masks and maintained social distance. it was very refreshing to have a real exhibition in a real exhibition space. And I love the sort of the setup, the anticipation of the exhibition, and the feedback from a real audience. And we got a pretty good turnout. I think there's a lot of pent-up demand for exhibitions. And again, all of these are on the website. In conjunction with Geoff's work, we also had some contemporary artwork produced by some students here at De Montfort University. I always think it's interesting that I called the exhibition 8-bit, but many of the microcontrollers that people are using to make modern artworks, Arduinos, for example, are 8-bit computers. In fact, a surprising similarity between the power of a typical Arduino and a ZX Spectrum, 32K or 48K, 8-bit processor, and so on. And we had a number of talks and introductions to all the work on display, as well as Geoff. So Geoff was able to join us, as you can see there, for the opening of the exhibition. So, like I say, I found this a very rewarding process to get the work out and in front of audiences. We also ran a live event, which is typically what I would do with my exhibitions, run some sort of live event, either responding to the exhibition or simply in the exhibition. And if you're interested, we have all the videos, a video of all the performers at the exhibition, all contemporary electronic and acoustic musicians, including my friend here, Rich, who was rather excited about the idea of performing in front of an audience for the first time in 2 years. And as you can see, we run the live event in front of and amongst all the artworks. And there are plenty of pictures of that live event as well. Now, if I just go back to my slides, I've mentioned the material that we have, but of course, this is from one collection. This is from Geoff's collection. We've now made sure that it's preserved in an archive, but we have some plans for the future. We would like to expand the collection to include other artists. So in particular, we're looking for artists who are active in the 1980s, and in particular, who used what you might call home computers. So computers such as the ZX Spectrum, BBC Micro, Commodore computer, maybe some industrial machines. There were Unix workstations and so on. But I am particularly interested in that story of what happened when creative people got this technology into their homes and began doing interesting things with it. We hope to have all of the work being exhibited at the BCS in London later this year. Of course, we might have hoped to have had this work as part of an EVA this year, but that wasn't to happen. So I'd like to think that a little bit later in the year, maybe in the autumn, we can install all 24 pieces together with the supporting material and digital material, and we can invite you to London to come and have a look at it. Maybe we'll do a sort of evening seminar or opening, that sort of thing. I'd also like to make the collection available for touring, so it can be shown elsewhere. And there will also be a special issue of Page, which is the Computer Arts Society's magazine. Page has been quiet for a few years, and I've taken over the editorial role on it. And this year, I would like to bring out a special issue on sort of 8-bit computer work with a catalogue of the microarts collection and use that really to stimulate interest and hopefully dialogue around that era. And again, attract more artists so we can build and expand on the collection. So if you're interested in knowing more about the work, computerartsarchive.com is where it's all archived. There will be links over to the recent exhibition in Leicester as well there. And you should also consider looking at Geoff's website, Microarts Group, Computer and Digital Art. And Geoff has produced a publication talking about this early work, and he's in the process of updating that to a second edition. This will be a physical publication, not just a PDF or an ebook, I believe. Geoff will correct me if I'm wrong, that you will be able to purchase probably through Amazon and other sort of bookstores and so on. So before I finish, what I'd quite like to do is see if Geoff would like to just pop in and say hello. So I will stop screen sharing. I can do now.
Hello, everyone.
And then I'd like to introduce Geoff. So we haven't got, we have a minute or so. So first thing I'd say is thanks very much for keeping the collection. And the big question is how did you manage to keep the work in such pristine condition over all these years?
Well, it's a good question, actually, because I lived abroad in 4 different places over that period, so it has traveled as well. And I was told that the cassette tapes, because they've been jiggled about a bit, it stops the oxide from sort of sagging or whatever. So they're in fine condition, incredibly. But yeah, it was all in a box. It just survived. And then a few years ago, I think it was probably about 10 years ago, actually, I got it out and just got the emulators on and put it onto the PC. And it stayed there as a curiosity for myself for a while. And then I did a master's at Middlesex University a while ago, but I decided to do more work at UAL in London, at Camberwell. And so I put the work up on a website and sort of started thinking about it a bit more seriously. And at that point is when it became public again, after this huge gap of being in my cardboard box. But I must say, Sean, thanks a lot for the exhibition. It was fantastic to see it up there. And I mean, I went up to Leicester a few times, had a great time up there. Very good show. I think everybody enjoyed it.
Great. Well, thanks very much. As I mentioned, we're going to have a demo a little bit later in the conference. I think we've got a Thursday scheduled, and I will be attempting to run the software live in an emulator. And I look forward to catching up again when we're hopefully opening the exhibition in London.
Yeah, it should be great. Yeah. I should mention also there was a text art piece in the micro art series MA4, which is a procedural story generator, because I write fiction occasionally, not very often, but I've been published a few times back then. So I started working with it for short stories, generating new short stories. And I'm continuing that text-based work at UAL in Camberwell now with open AI systems now. So I'm hoping to do a new exhibition of new work later this year as well. So obviously that's all linked to my arts website.
Okay, well, thanks very much for joining.
Fine.
Okay, have a look at the chat side, you guys, because people have written some very nice things and asked 1 or 2 questions and that. But thank you very much. And yes, we will definitely look forward